Hello everybody. Today we are going to take a look at how to make our apps more resilient. The apps can be mobile applications or web applications or web APIs when working with the HTTP resources. Also, we are going to take a look at how to implement circuit breaker pattern with polyNuget library, which is available in the .NET. We are going to implement it in the .NET API to showcase this. So what exactly is a circuit breaker? I'm sure you may have heard about this pattern in electrical field. In software engineering, the circuit breaker pattern helps us in designing the resilient apps. What is this pattern? It is used to enhance the resilience of an API or service by monitoring the availability of the dependency and preventing the continuous request when it becomes temporarily unavailable or experiences error. So here it's talking about the dependencies which are unreliable. What are the unreliable dependencies? They can be any external services, API, or even components that are prone to failure, instability, and intermittent availability issues. These are some of the problems that we may face without circuit breaker. What are the states of the service breaker? In closed state, the circuit breaker passes on the request to the third party API and passes back the response to the dependent API. The circuit breaker goes into open state when the third party API is returning the error in the past. The circuit breaker goes into half open state when the open timeout is reached. It will allow at least one request to pass through to check whether the third-party API is in good health or not. We are also going to take a look at the .NET specific implement. Here Poly will return error response for 10 seconds if the dependent API returns error 3 times. Two API projects. The first one is our API that we want to make resilient, and the other is the third party unreliable API that our products API will be calling. The products API has one cat endpoint and it is calling the unreliable API using this API client. The unreliable API client is making HTTP call using this HTTP client that is injected into it. The way it is injected is the main point here. It is injected by this simple extension that I have written just to make sure that the code for our circuit breaker is not in the program.cs file. The program.cs file is calling this unreliable API extension method, which is adding this unreliable API client, and it is adding the HTTP client into unreliable API client. Currently I have commented the code which does the circuit breaker for us just to showcase without circuit breaker what happens, and a little bit just to showcase what may happen if the success is taking 2 seconds, and whenever there is a problem on the third party API client, the third party API client is taking 5 seconds. So here it's showing that if the third party API client is taking 5 seconds to respond in case of error in it without running the unreliable HTTP client, so that just to show how much our API is ready to run. And as you can see, it's taking 5 seconds because our the third party API is not responding well. I'm going to make multiple requests to our API just to showcase what may happen when there are a lot of people mm, calling our API. As you can see, it took 51 seconds to respond all the 10 requests. So you can imagine if there are 100 requests, how much time it may take. Now let's implement the circuit breaker and see the difference in performance. So I'm going to uncomment the circuit breaker policy. What we are doing here is we are handling all the transient HTTP error, which means we are handling all the network failure, 5xx status code and 408 status code. And when we get these kind of errors, we are implementing the circuit breaker. If the third party API returns consecutively 3 times error, it will not send the request to the third party API for 10 seconds. And let's configure it in our HTTP client. Whenever the HTTP client is injected into the unreliable HTTP client, it is configured for this circuit breaker policy. We don't have to change anything in our unreliable HTTP client. Let us just run it and see what happens. The build succeeded and it is running. Let's run the 10 request now with the circuit breaker. It should take the same amount of time for the first 3 requests, but fourth request onwards it should return the error fast. As you can see, it took only 15 seconds to run the 10 requests. Now, in both the cases, the error was returned, but earlier without circuit breaker, it was taking 50 seconds. Now it is taking only 15 seconds. As you can see, there is a huge difference between that. Average the circuit breaker pattern when the request load is very high and our downstream systems are not reliable or not in our control. Having basic circuit breaker in our application does not make it resilient to all the scenarios. We have to implement the advanced circuit breaker. We have to implement the retry pattern as well so that the transient errors are handled correctly. Also, we have to implement the monitoring and alerts when the circuit breaker is hit so that we can take the proper reconciliation step. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.